Okay, we'll be starting momentarily. Okay, good afternoon. We're going to get started. I want to begin with just kind of briefly reviewing kind of the lay of the land in terms of the question of specifically women and the study of Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah. Again, part of really the thrust of what we've developed over the last few sessions is to highlight the remarkable development of the inclusion of, or the expansion of the Torah education to include girls and women, right? Which again, prior to the 19th century, other than on a very kind of ad hoc basis of individual women, was generally something, a girls' school as an institution was not something that really existed until the 19th century. And that there are clearly earlier halachic sources that would see the teaching of Torah in general, again, under certain, with certain details, and the teaching of Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah, specifically as something that was problematic for women. And that in general, and again, there are a number of kind of, as we saw, different variants on this idea, that as we come into modernity, right, and particularly into a time where there is a expansion in general of women's education and of women's roles, that the disconnect, right, between the lives that women were practically living and the education they were receiving with their level of Torah education, right, was seen already. And again, as we said, I guess the second session, right, that perhaps really the canary in the coal mine, as it were, about this issue is Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, right, who was really very adamant about this idea that without a proper and thorough and intensive Jewish education, right, the expectation that Jewish women would just on a mimetic level continue to be connected to and to uphold Jewish tradition was not a reasonable expectation, right? That particularly as where Jewish identity is something that is really an opt-in kind of situation, that without that educational undergirding, that Jewish women would essentially be lost to the Jewish people. So notwithstanding whatever the previous issues were, that there was a need to deal with it. And again, in various different iterations, this is something that we saw the Chafetz Chaim later very much endorsed this idea. And we talked about again that Rav Moshe Feinstein also, right, talks about this idea as well. And this becomes essentially the mainstream position throughout all groups by the end of the 20th century, that all groups that define themselves as Orthodox, right, continue to have this, have assimilated this notion, right, of the critical need for women's education. However, the issue of Torah Sheba'al Peh, right, in other words, whether that education, again, to put it most directly, right, includes a Talmudic education or not, right, that there continues, that into the 20th century, that there is resistance to this idea. So we saw that in the Hirschian milieu, that women were not taught Talmud, though, as we noted, the men weren't taught that much Talmud either, right, in Germany. So therefore, in certain ways, the disparity was not as significant. But that if we look at the attempts in Central and Eastern Europe in the early 20th century to create this new world of Jewish women's education, which again, it's important to realize how revolutionary that idea is on its own, right? That there was a general assumption, we saw this in the writings of the Chavetz Chaim, Rav Moshe Feinstein, and that this is reflected certainly in the curricula, essentially of the entire Haredi women's edifice of education, right? That this curriculum does not include, for the reason that we talked about before, maintains the traditional restriction on the teaching of Torah Sheba'al Peh, right? Talmud is not part of the curriculum. As we noted, I guess 2 times ago, there is an interesting question about whether this is applied completely consistently or not. In other words, can you really maintain this sharp dichotomy of things that are Torah Shebechsav or Torah Sheba'al Peh? And that, again, we saw, for instance, that the Chavetz Chaim mentions the teaching of Pirkei Avos, right, which is clearly Torah Sheba'al Peh, right? It becomes more of a matter of almost subject matter, right? Rather, which again is a innovative position. And then again, it becomes kind of a question of, is a woman allowed to look up a Talmudic reference, that's found, let's say, in a commentary in Chumash, which again, to the best of my knowledge, is something which is allowed to varying degrees in certain kinds of, even in the Haredi world, in seminaries and things like that. There are certain schools that made distinctions between looking at a photocopy as opposed to being engaged in intensive study. But then again, that is, and with a consistency to it as well, that is the basic position that we find throughout the Haredi world as a default, the education of women, but not the education of women in Torah Sheba'al Peh. We then saw the position of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who on the which was again quite fascinating, in that he was quite explicit conceptually in his endorsement of the idea of women studying Torah Sheba'al Peh, including, he's very specific about this, the Shakla V'Tarya, right? And there's the back and forth of Talmudic discussion, that he saw these things not only as positive, but again and again not only as necessary, right? That perhaps is the position of the Chavetz Chaim, right? That this is what we have to do. It's an emergency situation. Whereas the Lubavitcher Rebbe saw this as increasing Torah in the world, as perhaps itself a sign of messianic changes that were imminently occurring in the world, right? Which again is remarkable in its own right. At the same time, that this has not been directly adopted within the Chabad community for a variety of reasons that we tried to work through last time. So today we come to the person who is perhaps most seminal in terms of leading to the growth of women being involved in serious study of the oral Torah, of Torah Sheba'al Peh, and that is Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, right, known commonly as the Rav, right? The Rav, again, just for background, for those who are unfamiliar, and be reminded, grows up in an aristocratic rabbinic home in what Jews refer to as Lithuania. He is the son of Rav Moshe Soloveitchik, grandson of Rav Chaim Soloveitchik. Interestingly enough, his mother, who was actually, I believe, an aunt of Rav Moshe Feinstein, right, Rebbetzin Pesha Soloveitchik, was known that she would paskin for balabatim in the community her husband was the rabbi of, right? That she was very conversant in the laws of kashrus, and in order not to disturb him while he was learning, that she would routinely just tell people, well, this is what you should do with your pot or your chicken or whatever exactly with doing. And perhaps that's not irrelevant in terms of thinking about his own orientation towards these issues. He goes on to again, growing up as essentially a prodigy, goes on to the University of Berlin, where he gets a PhD in philosophy, and then he comes to Boston, where he lives for the rest of his life, and again is a leading scholar and leader in the Boston Orthodox Jewish community. And even though starting in the early 1940s, he becomes de facto the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva University, and commutes back and forth from Boston to New York for over 4 decades. That he never leaves Boston in that time, and is very invested in the Boston Jewish community. So if we are interested in the question of a programmatic a public statement on the part of the Rav in terms of the question of the education of women in the oral Torah, we're going to be disappointed, right? There is no programmatic statement of that sort, which is not completely surprising because the Rav relatively seldomly weighed in directly on these kinds of issues. Again, the Rav is generally perceived as having been the leading light of the modern Orthodox community in the United States in the years that he was active on the scene, but that he did not write, for the most part. If you're looking for a articulation of, let's call it, a philosophy of what might be referred to as modern Orthodoxy, he didn't really do that, right? He didn't weigh in directly on those issues, right? And that's, again, part of the reason why many of his students historically over the years have argued, right, sometimes quite vociferously, of trying to stake out based on private conversations, based on conduct, based on de facto positions that he took, trying to understand exactly what his position was. So when it comes to this, I want to look at essentially 3 different pieces of evidence, right, which will kind of help us get a better picture of the Rav's position on these issues. So the first is the Rav's role in the establishment and in the in his identification with the Maimonides Day School in Boston, which he and his wife essentially founded. Right, this is again in the relatively early period of day schools outside of the New York area. That again, he worked very hard, put a lot of time and effort and funds actually as well into the establishment and the functioning of the Maimonides School. And from the very beginning to this day, the Maimonides School was a fully coeducational institution. Now, this is a matter of great debate. There's actually been a lot written on this topic of what the Rav thought of coeducation, right? In other words, whether this was something that he identified with, or if this was something that he felt for the needs of the Boston Jewish community, whether at the time it was established or afterwards, that was a necessity in order for the school to be a success, right? Again, it's important to keep in mind, right, that certainly the standard, essentially at that time, and today also, right, of American education, of primary education, secondary education, was co-ed, right? That was almost kind of the expectation of how regular schools I'm sorry, Nina, I just saw your question in the chat. Did you ask that just now?
No, that was in the very beginning when you were going through justification for Torah.
Okay, so just very quickly, let's talk about the end. I would say the question does not represent an accurate reality, but let's get to it at the end. Remind me.
It's what we found when we went to be scholars in residence in those communities. It is.
Oh yeah, you're talking about certain Hasidic communities.
Okay.
Right. In other words, it's not. You're talking about. It's not at all universal in the Haredi world.
Okay, that's good to know.
Remind me at the end. In other words, again, it's like clearly every Beis Yaakov in the world teaches Chumash for 12 years, right? So you're talking very specifically about, Satmar Square, places like that.
Yes and yes. Thank you.
So we'll remind me at the end, and we'll come back to that. Okay.
No problem. Bye-bye.
Okay. So okay. So the issue of coeducation Maimonides, which is not really our issue per se, right? Why the Maimonides school was co-ed. It is worth noting that there were attempts a number of times to explore coeducation at Yeshiva College, right, which he was also simultaneously very involved in, and he was known to have been opposed anytime that came up. And again, part of the anybody who's interested in reading more on this issue, I can give you some interesting articles as well. Clearly, he was totally, seemingly fine with coeducation in Maimonides. He never that again, even if it's a question of, what the numbers were at the very beginning of when he started the school, that he never in the, I guess almost 45 years that he was involved in the school, never did he make an attempt to separate the genders in any way. Yet at the same time, when he came to Yeshiva College, he was certainly opposed to that. So how exactly, what the position is a matter of discussion to this day. What's important for our purpose now, right, is that part of that coeducation, right, was that it was true for all subjects, including the study of Talmud, right, that all classes in Maimonides were co-ed, including the Talmud classes that were provided. And it's very clear from the very beginning that that was his intention. Now, we know more about this today because of a letter that was published in a volume that came out, I guess, about 15 years ago. 15 years ago, called Community, Covenant, and Commitment. It's a very interesting book. It is a collection of letters from Rabbi Soloveitchik's files, letters he wrote to people, to institutions, and so forth, dealing with all kinds of very interesting issues. And one of them comes, it's a correspondence or a brief correspondence, right, with a Rabbi Leonard Rosenfeld, right, who was the chairman of the education committee of a school called High Hebrew Institute of Long Island, which is the antecedent of what is today the Hafter School, which is about this question of Talmud study for girls. And again, I will read the statement. Right? He says, as to your question with regard to a curriculum in a coeducational school, I expressed my opinion too long ago that it would be very regrettable oversight on our part, right, if we were to arrange separate Hebrew courses for girls. Right? It would be a regrettable oversight. Not only is the teaching of Torah Sheba'al Peh to girls permissible, but is nowadays an absolute imperative. And again, I'll just read it again for emphasis, is today an absolute imperative. This policy of discrimination between the sexes as to subject matter and method of instruction, which is still advocated by certain groups within our Orthodox community, has contributed greatly to the deterioration and downfall of traditional Judaism. Boys and girls alike should be introduced into the inner halls of Torah Sheba'al Peh. I hope to prepare in the near future a halachic brief on the problem, which will exhaust the various aspects of the same. In the meantime, I heartily endorse a uniform program for the entire student body. With kindest personal regards, I remain sincerely yours, Joseph Soloveitchik. Right. So we see. So again, this halachic brief. Unfortunately, it would be wonderful to have this in our hands. Right. Perhaps it existed and has not come to light. As far as I know, nobody has this. But it would certainly be an amazing work to be able to have in our hands. But again, reading this letter in tandem with the curriculum that he indeed was actively involved in implementing in the Maimonides school, right, would seem to indicate that he was that it is clear, and I don't think there's that even though again there's a lot of different takes, right, on Rav Soloveitchik among his own students, and certainly the issue of how he felt about coeducation is legitimately in a matter of debate among his disciples and students. In terms of the question that he endorsed the study of Torah Sheba'al Peh in the Maimonides school, I think everyone very clearly agrees with that. And again, that this letter gives us a little bit of a backdrop that he really felt that this was and in many ways, again, there's an article by Mayor Chorsky who argues in a certain way that essentially what we're seeing here is the same position conceptually as Rav Hirsch, as the Chafetz Chaim, right? However, in application, it was even broader. In other words, that those earlier rabbis, right, felt that there was a need to provide Jewish education in order to, so to speak, keep women in the fold and so forth, right? This is a even, let's call it, broader or more radical application of the same idea. The other thing that we know for a fact is that the Rebbe sent all of his children to the Maimonides school, and that he learned with his children in adulthood as well. And we have a fascinating essay by his son-in-law, Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, who's going to be the subject of our next talk. Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, who had been a student at Yeshiva College, again, someone who himself was a great prodigy and was very close to the Rav. When he completed college, the Rav encouraged him to pursue a PhD that the Rav saw. That perhaps this is also kind of a European educational model, right? That one's education was not complete without a PhD, right? Pretty high standard as far as that's concerned. And Rav Lichtenstein went and actually studied English literature at Harvard, right? There's some, there are those that speculate that the Rav himself was more perhaps interested in philosophy and the hard sciences rather than the humanities, but be that as it may, right? I think it was probably a pretty rigorous program as it worked out. However, as part of the arrangement that Rav Lichtenstein made with Rav Soloveitchik when coming to Boston, is that he would study with him over that time. And the way that Rav Lichtenstein writes about it, that during this period when he was in graduate school, he spent about 6 hours a day immersed in Torah study, which again, I imagine this is that a 1950s Harvard PhD in literature, right, was not like kind of a Mickey Mouse program. You imagine that it was a pretty intense kind of schedule. And he says among the learning, and this is almost like a deal that he struck, right, is that he was admitted into private study circles that the Rav had with his own children, right? That he said that the Rav essentially had these two groups that he would learn during the time that he was not in New York with his three children, his daughter Tova, who later goes on to marry Rav Lichtenstein, his daughter Atara, and her husband, Rabbi Dr. Yitzchak Twersky, who later goes on to become the chair of the Jewish Studies Department in Harvard, and his son Chaim, who again goes on to be a very significant historian and professor. Right. So there was one group where the Rav learned with his daughters, his son-in-law, and Rav Lichtenstein. The other group, right, was a group that included his son Reb Chaim. He says to some extent Dr. Twersky and Rav Lichtenstein. Now, so again, within the Rav's own home unit, he had two different kind of Gemara shiurim going on for the family and the intimate circle. Right, one of which was co-ed, one of which was both men. So he says the curriculum was quite interesting. He says the group that learned, the family unit group, learned, he said they first studied matters relating to the Yom Naraim and Sukkot. Then we learned the entire Masechet Beitza. Then we finished all of Brachot. Right, so again, these are, that was the group that was the co-ed, daughter, son, son-in-law, future son-in-law. Second group, Reb Chaim, Dr. Yitzchak Twersky, and they learned the first 13 daf of Bava Kama, right, and the first 9 dapim of Zvachim. Now, the reason that I mention this, I'll clarify why this is significant in a moment, right, is that while, again, it is fascinating and remarkable, right, to realize, first of all, how much time, right, this is not like some kind of like parent-child learning program, for 45 minutes on a Saturday night, right? This is study with adult children on a regular basis. Now, there is an interesting distinction between the two groups, right? So on the one hand, right, the group that was the co-ed group, right, were studying matters that had to do with the laws of Yom Tov and the laws of tefillah, right, of prayer, right, which is what Maseches Brachos is about. The second group, right, the smaller all-male group, and again, the kind of stratospheric level is significant, studied much more what you would call classical yeshiva Talmud learning. And there's Bava Kama, right, which deals with Torah law, and with Zvachim that deals with laws connected to the sacrifices. And the pace was much slower. In other words, in group number one, now again, we don't know details how often these groups met, but the point is that group number one, they finish 2 entire tractates of the Talmud. In group number two, right, they finish together, right, 12 pages, right, of the Talmud. I'm sorry, 20 pages of the Talmud, right? So what it tells you 2 things. Number one, that the second group, right, in all likelihood, right, was a much more intensive, deep dive in terms of the material covered and the depth of what's going on. And one would imagine that the distinction between the 2 study circles, right, the one that involved the women, right, one would guess, right, was on a somewhat perhaps lower level. Now again, right, these men, right, were for the most part, right, the Lichtenstein certainly had been studying yeshivas for years and years and years, right, there was, I would imagine, a much deeper level of Talmudic knowledge on their part, right? However, there is a suggestion which has been made, right, that the Rav did feel that when it came to subject matter, right, that he continued to maintain a certain level of difference between men and women. In other words, the idea that the more theoretical topics that are the Masechtos that were learned in, we'll call it the boys group for the moment, right, that he felt that perhaps was something that was more appropriate for men, whereas that within, when it came to women, right, again, that perhaps because of the earlier halakhic precedent of the idea that it can make a very easy case can be made that women need to be conversant with those halakhic topics that apply to them directly, right, that perhaps there was such a distinction in place. Now, why do I mention this? I mention it because the curriculum in the Maimonides school, right, always, right, when it came to Talmud, was much more similar to the co-ed group in the Rav's own home, right? They studied sections of Masechtos, right, Psachim, Chulin, I want to say Brachos, in other words, Masechtos that had that translated much more directly, right, to halachic practice. Now, there are those that suggest that the Rav chose that, and again, those Masechtos are not necessary. Shabbos, I think, also are those Masechtos are not what is generally kind of the classic Lithuanian yeshiva curriculum, right? And the classic Lithuanian yeshiva curriculum focuses on what we call Nashim Nezikin, right? And on Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, Bava Basra, to some degree Sanhedrin, Ksubas, Yevamos, Kiddushin, Gittin, right? That's kind of the classic curriculum. That wasn't really taught in Maimonides. So the question is this, and we don't have an answer to this question. Did the Rav have let's call it a nuance in what he felt was appropriate to be taught to women? And since he felt for educational reasons that certainly in a co-ed setting, right, that you shouldn't be making distinctions between one gender and the other. So you should learn something which is Shava L'chol Nefesh, something which is equally accessible. Or maybe it has nothing to do with that at all, right? It has more to do with what the Rav felt was appropriate for, let's call it a day school audience, right? That this was not a school that was necessarily kind of a preparatory school for going on to study in yeshivas, right? And so therefore, perhaps he felt that what was needed for the American Jewish committed layperson, right, is a different Talmudic curriculum that, again, having nothing to do with gender, right, than a classical yeshiva would present. So again, all of this is speculation. I mentioned it though, just because again, I think the testimony itself is quite fascinating. About these family circles of learning that went on, and again, it raises this question: is there a distinction of subject matter that we do not know? That we don't know exactly what the reason for it was. Now, the most significant though contribution to the study of Torah, of Talmud for women, takes place in Stern College in the late 1970s. And there's actually an article by Rabbi Saul Berman that is it's available online on the Lair House website. What I want to do is essentially share with you the story that he tells. And he talks about the idea that he and the Rav's son, Chaim Soloveitchik, in 1976, who was teaching in Stern College, I think at the time as well, right, was talking about the question of why Talmud is not being systematically taught at Stern College, right? So Stern College, when it was established, right, has a Jewish studies requirement, just as its men's counterpart Uptown did. But again, very different. It was all kind of classroom-based classes, whereas the core of the yeshiva, right, was learning in the traditional style, base medrash, chavrusa learning, followed by shiur, very, very Talmud-centric, and nothing in all resembling that existed on the Stern College campus, right? And again, even though the classes did indeed incorporate source material that was Talmudic in origin, right? There was no programmatic way of developing skills for Talmud learning. And in 1977, Stern College decides they are going to create base medrash courses, and that these courses would involve a combination again of chavrusa and lecture time, and they had some 60 students who were interested in doing this, and that they recruited, and the person who taught this for the first year is Mori Rebbe, Rabbi Mordechai Willig, who, it's interesting, Rabbi Willig today is not an advocate for the most part of Talmud study for women. He wrote an article on the topic a couple of years ago with his misgivings. It's clear that this was something that, as we'll see, the Rav endorsed, but he felt, looking back over 40 years, and maybe we'll come back to this at the end, he has his own misgivings about the direction that this took. But again, it's a matter of record that he was the one who gave the initial shiur for women in Gemara in Stern College. So it's interesting, before they began, right, that Rav Soloveitchik agreed that he would give the opening shiur in Stern College, that he wanted to make it clear that he was indeed endorsing this program. It was with his full halachic imprimatur, and he decided that he would go down on Monday, October 11th, 1977, right, Rav Soloveitchik, together with Rabbi Dr. Norman Lanzer, who is the president of Yeshiva University, and Dean Bacon. They came back. The Rav sits down. There are pictures of this. I should really show you a picture of the first shiur. It's a famous. Give me 1 second. Sorry, I should have. You would have think I would have thought of this in advance, but it's. Sorry, we'll. I'll share it for a second. Give me 1 second. Sorry. Okay. So we'll get the picture in for posterity. Okay, so here's the picture of the first shiur at Stern College. You see, here's the Rav with a bottle of 7-Up here for refreshment. And it is nostalgic for 1970s era soda, I can see the bottle there. Next to him is Rabbi Lamb. Next to him here is Rabbi Saul Berman, and here is a very young Rabbi Mordechai Willig. Right, so this is the classic picture, right, of this particular event. So the shir was given, and again, it was a shir opening Maseches Pesachim, the tractate of the Talmud, which deals with Pesach. And again, it was a very high-level shir in the style of his regular shir giving. And the way that Rabbi Berman writes up the story, I'm going to read the quote, right, that he has from this. I'm very glad you invited me to come to give your first shir, and I hope actually a year later to see that you've displayed interest in Torah Shebaal Peh. Without Torah Shebaal Peh, there is no Judaism. Any talk about Judaism minus Torah Shebaal Peh is just meaningless and absurd. It's like if one never studied physics and writes the philosophy of nature. It's ridiculous. You can't write the philosophy of nature before you're acquainted with physics, so you cannot write about Judaism if you're not acquainted with Torah Shebaal Peh. It's important that not only boys should be acquainted, but girls as well. I'll support you as far as education is concerned. If you have problems, come to me. I'll fight your battles. I will wish you success, bracha v'hatzlacha, which again, ironically enough, that is the phrase bracha v'hatzlacha that the Belzer Rebbe extended to Sarah Schneerer when she first had the notion of starting Beis Yaakov. Rabbi Berman says that the Rav said to him before he left, tell them if their fathers or brothers say to them, what are you doing learning Gemara? Bistach nara meidel, you're just a girl. Tell them not to engage. They should refer their fathers and brothers to me. I will answer for them. Right? So that's the account that Rabbi Berman wrote up, right, of his recollections of what happened. To the best of my knowledge, this was I may be wrong about this, but this was a one-time event. In other words, the Rav did not continue to be actively involved in that program. It's again approximately 20 years after this story. Stern expanded to the program. Some of you might have heard I did an interview with one of the leading teachers in the program, the graduate program in Talmud study at Stern, which is kind of a trying to produce female scholars. My interview with Gedalia Berger, if anyone wants to know more about the program, is welcome to listen to that. But in many ways, this is the antecedent to that. Right now, the Rav himself in 1978 is now near the end of his career. He is rapidly aging, and that eventually in 1986, he leaves the scene completely and is essentially bedridden for the rest of his life. And that beyond those specific things, the Rav is not actively involved, right, in teaching, in teaching Talmud directly to women, right? What we will see though is that a number of the Rav's students, right, really become very involved with this. And the Rav's son-in-law, Aaron Lichtenstein, wrote extensively actually on this topic. And that's really kind of where we'll pick up as we move toward the end of the series. We're going to look at Lichtenstein's role in dealing with this, that there are a number of important essays that he wrote on the topic, as well as institutions that he was involved in setting policy for, right? To again, in many ways, based on the model that the Rav set up to start with, to kind of move forward as far as that's concerned. All right, so we will stop here. I'm happy to entertain any questions before we break for the week.
Yeah, I'd like to.
Yeah. You say, I think you're muted.
While he's working with this technology, do you want to get back to how the Hasidim decide that women shouldn't even read the Chumash?
So again, in other words, like you also have so two things. So within the groups that you're talking about, I think it kind of that so it's White Center about that because it's filled with midrashim. But again, it's reflective of the fact that in general those groups are the most conservative, right, when it comes to these questions in general. I think that that's the and again, I know so much of it's a restriction in some of those circles. I don't even know if they have the Hebrew textual skills to be able to read Chumash effectively, to be able to read it and translate it.
But what are they afraid of with the women reading the
Years.
Torah?
What?
Why are they afraid for women to read the Torah?
Well, I think again, you'd have to ask them, as far as that's concerned. I think that again, that they continue to have a very conservative reading of the traditional sources, right? Where women, certainly you could justify such a reading, where women didn't learn at all or weren't given the tools to be able to learn on that level. But again, that's what you're talking about is reflective of very specific groups. I'm not aware of the demographics. I'll tell you one story though. Again, Samar is a large community. So I went when 2 years ago after the terrible attack in Jersey City, right? I went to a shiva of one of the participants. There's a woman who was killed there. And her husband talked about the fact that that she had a nightly shiur in Mesilas Yesharim that she used to listen to religiously, that she would go through that. Now, again, right, that's not again, I don't know what the shiur was actually like, right, but certainly it was, in theory, on a kind of textual, philosophical book. So the question of, you have to know who you're talking to as well. It's it may be more complicated, who does what, even when it comes to those communities. Okay, Yisrael.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I recall that number weeks ago or months ago.
Oh, I'm sorry, you just went out again.
Weeks ago or months ago, we had Gedalia Berger.
Yes.
And I recall that he gave a list of things that he was the students, and there was nothing on Seder Nezikin.
Can I? I'm sorry. Do you mind typing in the chat? Just we're getting terrible feedback.
I believe he.
I'm sorry. I'm still just getting terrible feedback.
Yeah. I believe that he was. He gave a list, and he. I noticed that nothing was. He wasn't giving any shiurim in Seder Nezikin.
Okay. So again, I don't know. I would have to go back and take a look at that, whether that is again reflective of that idea. The only thing is, I believe his official role is he teaches halacha.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it would make sense that he's focusing on halachic topics. I don't know if that is, in general, kind of reflective of the curriculum. It's an interesting question. All right, we will stop here again next week, God willing. We are back. Looking forward to seeing everyone. Chumash on schedule for tomorrow morning. A great day to everybody.